I wanted to offer you a few insights into Matthew chapter 18. If you're leading a discussion group of any description, maybe you're just leading a discussion time with your family, or you're doing some personal reflection on the biblical text from this past Sunday, maybe you're a life group leader and you're reviewing some of this together, there are a number of things that you might want to consider. Now, of course, you could just kind of review the sermon and kind of walk through the various points and make some observations. Quite often I find that there are those who have questions as they've gone through the message, and they may or may not have written those questions down, but those questions kind of remain unanswered and can be a great material for you guys to dig into together as you would go back and review the biblical text together. I wanted to make the point that you could meet with someone who wasn't in the sermon, in the service, and still have a really fruitful discussion, because the point is to go back to the biblical text and to review what's there. I've led life groups where we had individuals who didn't even attend our church that were part of the life group, and we just go back and we would read, in this case, Matthew chapter 18, verse 21 through the end of the chapter. We'd read it together and we'd start discussing it, because it's always fascinating. It's God's Word. You may find that your group loves to do that, and that's exactly what they need, and you've got one or two questions, and that'll be the full extent of the time that you need together. The sermon discussion questions on the back of the sermon notes can be a great place to begin with that. I also wanted to provide for you sort of an and then some segment, so that if your group says, look, kind of been there, done that, don't really have any more questions about that. Is there more that we could or should discuss? And the answer is always going to be yes, because I can never, and any of us as preachers can never explore the full extent of everything that's possibly there in the biblical text. And so one thing that I would point out is that this past Sunday we began kind of a little experiment, I guess, if you will. And Tricia Palmer was painting through much of the service. And the point isn't so much what she's painting, the point is the idea that she is painting. And that's an allegory, an analogy for you and I, because we're always kind of painting an image of God. And sometimes we paint accurately and we get it right. Sometimes we paint inaccurately and we get it wrong. And part of the point of this 2020 Vision Looking to Jesus series is that we would paint well. We would the image in our mind's eye of who Jesus is and what Jesus does would be refreshed, renewed, informed. Maybe we need to go back and do some erasing, some repainting of that image, because we didn't always get it right. We've had some ideas about God, some ideas about Jesus that just are not biblically valid and need to be recoded. So that could provide some interesting discussion. Matthew chapter 18 verse 21 comes at the end of what's called the fourth discourse, or the fourth sermon that Jesus preached. Matthew in his gospel is building a case that Jesus is the expected Messiah of the Jewish people. And in order to do that, he provides five different sermons of Jesus. They refer to them as the discourses because sometimes it's teaching of Jesus that's been brought together. It wasn't necessarily delivered in one teaching segment. In most cases, it's a summary of what Jesus taught with exactly his words, but his teaching would take an hour or two. People would gather for a day on a hillside, and we can read it through in 10 minutes, 15 minutes. So clearly, he said more than what was there. Those five discourses, Matthew chapter 18 is the fourth. The first one is the Sermon on the Mount, so Matthew chapter 5, 6, 7. Chapter 18 begins with the disciples coming together and asking Jesus, who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And we could actually go back a little bit before that, and it starts. You could start reading at chapter 17, verse 22, and Jesus' prediction of his death. You could read through that entire segment and get a bigger picture for how we get into this unmerciful servant piece at chapter 18, verse 21. There is a thread about how are we going to live together as followers of Jesus that's present in this segment? And the answer, according to Frederick Bruner, one commentator that I've been reading, would be there's this thread about love and how we relate to one another. And at the beginning of chapter 18, this question, who's the greatest? And Jesus brings a child into it. And this is, we think children in our culture as being endearing, precious, innocent. In that culture, children were on the very bottom rung. I know it's hard for us to comprehend how that could even be in our culture, but in their culture it was just very different. And for him to put a child there and to say, if you want to enter the kingdom of heaven, you need to become like this child. Everyone's looking around saying, I don't want to be a child. I was there, been there, done that, don't like it. Didn't want it to be there. Couldn't wait until I grew up and could have some respect. Could manage my life, could go where I want to go. Because a child, of course, is utterly dependent on the father. Which would be the point that we see there. And then we come into some of these other texts that talk about, well, what do we do when someone falls away? You know, how is it that we would address in kingdom relationship with one another these kind of situations? And then, of course, we get to this parable of the unmerciful servant, and Peter asks, how many times do I have to forgive someone who's fallen away? How gracious do we have to be? Come on, Jesus. And he uses the example, I may have mentioned this on Sunday, the Hebrew scholars, they would claim that 3 times is the limit. Forgive them once, forgive them twice, 3 strikes, you're out. 4th time, you don't have to forgive them, you don't have to restore them, away with them. Peter's being generous. He's been hanging around Jesus long enough that he knows, how about 7 times? And Jesus says, how about 70 times 7 or 77 times? It's hard to know from the Greek exactly what is meant there, but the point is the same. It's unlimited forgiveness. And we got into that this coming Sunday. And we can say, well, Jesus, that seems to be kind of naive. And yet the context of all of this has been naivete. It's to innocent dependence upon God. And like a child. And we come back and say, wow. Have you noticed how forgiving a child can be? They want to forgive. That's their predisposition. And Jesus, of course, in the end of chapter 18 of Matthew is saying, you have been forgiven this enormous debt, and therefore need to live out that same kind of graciousness as those who have received much give much. And so it becomes a reorienting of our lives, of the character of who we are. And it's tough stuff. It's not saying go back into an abusive situation. Make sure your group knows this. It's not saying going back, that I just say, hey, come on and hit me again. Not at all. Not at all. There is an appropriate thing called boundaries. Forgiveness is not the same as having necessary healthy boundaries in your life. I can live in forgiveness with someone whom I'm not in intimate relationship with anymore. And that could be true of a parent, it could be true of a child that abuses, it could be true of a partner who has not treated you the way God would have you be treated. We're going to talk about that next week, because it moves into marital relationships, family relationships, and this thread about love and how do we live together with one another continues. So hopefully this is a little bit of an and then some, a more helpful piece for you as you go to questions. You are welcome to just camp on one question. There might be one question that works for your group and it just goes together. There may be multiple questions, or you may want to scan through some of this and say that, I think my group might like to benefit from going here. So bless you and your family. Bless you if you're a group of friends gathering around a kitchen table or your living room. Bless you if you're a life group that's pursuing Jesus together. I pray that you would have just a rich and wonderful time in all of this pursuit. Bless you. Bye for now.